All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Today, when you leave here, I want you to know more about the 19th century and the round of imperialism that happens in that century. So that's our title today, 19th century imperialism. Now, to connect it, in the past, yesterday, we looked at 19th century imperialism in China. Before that, we've looked at imperialism in the Americas following the time of Columbus. But I want to distinguish today imperialism in Africa. So that's going to be our main location. So when you leave here today, I hope that you can leave here understanding why globalization and imperialism comes to Africa. And I want you to be able to understand how it comes to Africa. I want you to understand specifically the contest that is called the Scramble for Africa. And ultimately, we'll get to decolonization. So I'm going to begin this story by talking about Social 20 and nationalism. So next year, you're going to study the French Revolution, and you're going to see this new collective identity, this birth of fraternity, this birth of nationalism. And by the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, French nationalism will begin to sow the seeds of other alien nationalisms in response. So we'll see German nationalism rise up, and Austrian nationalism, Spanish nationalism. So we have this new sense of identity. And key to the idea of identity, of nationalism, is this idea that my collective is the best. My collective is the best. You know, we are the best. But the problem is, how do you measure that? How do you measure that? Well, one way to measure it is through military fighting, right? Through war. But following the Napoleonic Wars, Europe had tried to commit to solving their problems through diplomacy, trying to avoid war among each other. So we have the long 19th century between the Napoleonic era and World War I, where the major powers of Europe are trying to prevent war among each other. Can you what now? I'm recording a video right now. So, sure, come on in. Yeah. Let's do that.
I did have a thesis statement picked earlier,
Of course.
but I forgot. I forgot.
Say
that
hi
I
to
picked
everybody
it.
in YouTube land.
Hi, YouTube. I had already picked it, but I forgot. And so
No, that's good.
it
Thank you.
worked.
I will update your mark.
And now I didn't want to leave the zero.
I understand that. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
That's a good thesis. We can talk on Monday about your body that you can create surrounding it. All right, everybody, let's get back to the story of nationalism. So because we have these nations that have this identity that we are the best, and they need to quantify it, right? They need to measure it. They need to demonstrate it, but they've committed to not going to war with each other. They need another way to compete. They're going to compete economically. So part of today's story is about an economic competition to see who has the most gold. It'd be like a board game. And I'm into board games. Maybe you're not. But I like board games. I think I own about 140. So if you know of a board game, I probably own it. But mercantilism is like a board game, where the object of the game is to see who in the end has the most gold. So the first term that I'm throwing at you today is mercantilism. It's on the sideboard if you can't spell it. It's also sometimes pronounced mercantilism. I like mercantilism. So mercantilism is this competition for gold. We're going to measure the strength of our nation by seeing who has the most gold. That's what's going to quantify that my nation's better than yours. So how do we get gold? Well, we're going to try to create exclusive trade relationships. Exclusive trade relationships. It's the opposite of free trade. So in free trade, You might have a country that has free trade agreements with multiple countries. So Canada trades with the United States, but we also have free trade with Mexico. And we have other agreements in place with European countries and Asian countries. Canada is a global trading player. But it hasn't always been that way. There's a time when Canada was a colony. And there's resources in Canada that could only be shipped back to our mother country. That's an example of mercantilism. So another example of mercantilism, one that we'll study next week, comes from India. India was once seen as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire because it was so rich in resources. One of the most important being the people of India. But one of the resources that the British coveted in India was indigo. So they needed to take the crop of indigo, harvest it, take that back to Manchester and Leeds where the factories are in England, use that to make textiles, and then sell it. So one way to play this game of mercantilism is to engage in imperialism. So because you're trying to get as much gold as possible, you begin to control others, other players. And England tries to control India and says to India, you can only trade with us. We need that indigo. We don't want you selling it to France because that'll make them strong. In a zero-sum theory world, we can't allow France to get stronger because then we get weaker compared to France. So if we're going to outcompete the French, if we're going to show that we're more powerful than the French, then we need to only selling your indigo to us. So mercantilism and imperialism are connected. In order to have the most gold, we need to control others and make sure they only trade with us. And as we control India, the British presence in India will grow. And we'll see this next week in that case study. It'll grow from just having a company there to having troops to making it a colony. So mercantilism will lead to imperialism and ultimately help create an empire. While you're studying, I want you to connect language. If you struggle on multiple choice, one of the strategies I would suggest with your vocabulary building is try to relate terms together. Don't learn terms independent of each other. Today we're looking at mercantilism, imperialism, we're looking at empires. They're all connected. Mercantilism is this idea we need more gold. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to do that by having exclusive trading zones. We're going to create these exclusive trade relationships. So therefore, we need imperialism so we can dominate others. And then ultimately, we build an empire. It's not quite that simple, but it sure connects well. So I need to follow this up and say, well, what are they using the gold for? Gold isn't always gold. When I'm talking about gold, it's a placeholder for things of value. And in the 19th century, they're looking for two types of things. One thing that was very valuable for them, one thing that they would get from their colonies, was raw materials that would be the building blocks of the Industrial Revolution. Raw materials that would be the building blocks of the Industrial Revolution. So England is the first country in the world to go through the Industrial Revolution, and they had some advantages. They had coal, but they don't have all of the natural resources they need. So they need to look to the world for those natural resources. So they look to India. They have indigo. They create a colony in England or in India so they can have this exclusive trade relationship and take that indigo back to England and fuel the Industrial Revolution there. So one of the reasons behind 19th century imperialism is we need raw materials for the Industrial Revolution. So if you're keeping track, the first reason I mentioned was kind of a competition, right, among the European powers to see who was most powerful. The second one now is we need to fuel our Industrial Revolution. We need the building blocks. An example of the building blocks will come from the Congo. In the 19th century, two consumer products that began to explode, one at the beginning of the 19th century, one at the end, would be bicycles and automobiles. So automobiles are, one of those commodities, to one of those consumer items that is now in high demand at the turn of the 20th century. And we need rubber. We need rubber to make the tires. There's no rubber native to Europe. So where are you going to get rubber from? You're going to get it from Africa. So I'm going to tell you a longer story of how we come to the Congo. But in the story of basically why they get there, they're looking for the building blocks of the Industrial Revolution. And this is how they get there now. So there's an individual called Dr. David Livingstone. Dr. David Livingstone. And I see some of you guys looking up to see if the spelling of his name's on the board. I can just write it up there for you if you want. Guess I should say Dr. David Livingstone. Dr. Livingstone, being a doctor, he wanted to travel to Africa to serve the people. He was there to offer medicine. He was there to offer, some kind of guidance and advice that may help the quality of life of those people living in Africa. He was there to serve the people. And I would argue that Dr. Livingstone became the first global celebrity. So we have many celebrities today, but I would say that Dr. Livingstone may have been the first global celebrity. Because as he was traveling into Africa, into places where no American or European had ever been, he was writing letters and shipping them back. And many of his stories would be told in newspapers in New York, in London, and in Paris. And suddenly he had a following. People were excited to read about what was happening because for Americans and Europeans, to them it was the equivalent of hearing a journey of someone that was in an alien land because they'd never been there. They're fascinating stories. So readers were, buying newspapers to read about Dr. Livingstone. And then suddenly the stories stopped coming in. He was feared to be dead. One of the individuals that was, hooked on the story that was Dr. Livingstone was King Leopold of Belgium. And he kind of wanted to know, what happened to this guy. So there's going to be an individual called David Stanley who's going to be financed. He's going to get some financing from people like King Leopold, and he's going to go looking for Dr. Livingstone. And very famously, Stanley, after being in Africa for many, many weeks, he comes into a village. He sees a white guy. He goes up to the white guy and he's like, Dr. Livingstone, I presume? Because he's so deep into Africa, he hasn't seen any European, Caucasian people for weeks. This has got to be Dr. Livingstone. And it is. So Stanley finds Livingstone. So what's the significance of this? How does this get to the how Europeans begin to carve up Africa? Well, as Stanley and Livingstone have been, reporting about what they see in Africa, King Leopold of Belgium, he begins to see the wealth that is Africa. He's like, wow, there's a lot of resources there. And he claims what is now the area around the Congo River Basin, as his personal property. He says, that's mine. And this land grab inspires a continent-wide land grab. So when King Leopold says the Congo's mine, then all the other kings and queens and stuff representing their countries, they're like, well, we want parts of Africa too. So they met in Berlin. And often I see it as 1885, but I have also seen Berlin Conference of 1884. So let's just look it up. Berlin Conference. And then scramble for Africa. Well, they're even showing it here. 1884 to 85. Maybe that's why, because it lasted a few months. So what did they do there? As you can see in this picture, they carved up Africa. They met in Berlin, invited no Africans, to decide the fate of Africa. This part, France will get this part. England can have this area. Germany, Portugal, this is what you get. Italy, this is your part over here. That's how they come to Africa. They have a conference in Berlin. And now they have a conference because they want to avoid war. They want to maintain the peace that they've had without a couple of exceptions since the Napoleonic era. So they believe that if the European powers could sit down diplomatically and just resolve who gets what in Africa, then they can all go to Africa and get rich. So that's the how part. Now, some people tried to justify what they're up to. Some people tried to justify what they're up to in Africa by saying, the world has many groups, and some are childlike. Some pockets of people are childlike, and they need the help of those who may have, more knowledge of modern medicine and more knowledge of modern literature and science. And therefore, we have a responsibility to serve them. So there's a concept here called paternalism. And it's used to try to justify why we are going to Africa. Well, they're childlike. They need our help. We're going to teach them about science and medicine, and their lives will be better because of it. But what we're also seeing here is a version of ethnocentrism that is really called Eurocentrism. Ethnocentrism is a word that means my ethnic group's the best. And what we're seeing when Europeans are sitting down in Berlin, carving up the cake that is Africa, and trying to justify it by saying, well, we're going to help them, this is a very Eurocentric idea. This idea that we have something that they need, that we're better than they are. So, a underlining theme here in 19th century imperialism is Eurocentrism. It's justified because we can elevate them. So far, I mentioned that 19th century imperialism really is connected to nationalism. You got these nations, England and France, Germany, that want to say, this is how great we are. The British end up getting an empire that the sun never sets on. It covers a quarter of the Earth's surface. And the Germans are like, wait a minute. The English are Anglo-Saxons that fled Germania because they were the lesser of the Germanic tribes. So why does England, the Anglo-Saxons, the weakest of the Germans, why did they get an empire that covers a quarter of the Earth's surface and we don't have an empire? So Germany literally said, we want our place in the sun. So there was this growing national competition to see who had enough colonies. And a part of that was a grab for gold. A grab for gold to get rich, to fuel their industrial revolution. So we have all of these things coming together. Mercantilism and imperialism and empires. Fitting in with the industrial revolution. Fitting in with nationalism. Fitting in with Eurocentrism and ethnocentrism and paternalism. All of these terms today come together. And as you learn vocabulary for multiple choice, that's how you need to connect terms. See how they connect to each other. One last thought. Not everybody was anti-imperialism, right? Many people were like, proud to be a part of the British Empire. And Rudyard Kipling writes a poem called The White Man's Burden. And he's writing it at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. He's writing it, and he's speaking indirectly to the Americans. So he doesn't say, "Yo, America, listen to me. You got a place to." I don't know. I'm not gonna rap today. But he is speaking indirectly to America, and the message is that America needs to take up the white man's burden. That Rudyard Kipling wants the Americans to begin the enterprise of empire, specifically in the Philippines. Now that America's fought a war with the Spanish, and they become a part of being like the Spanish are gone, and now the Philippines are like a protectorate of America, Rudyard Kipling's like, this is what you need to go in and do. So today, in a moment, you're going to be looking at a document. It's going to have a whole bunch of sources beginning with that poem. And with each source, I don't want you to do an A1. You don't have time. There's like 40 sources here. It's insane. But what I want you to do is look at the prompt. Each prompt very specifically should allow you to pull out a nuance of the source to help you practice your A1 skills. So that's the assignment for you to do today. Now, maybe you're sitting there in your seat and you're saying, you know what, I don't think I totally get the Scramble for Africa. In this lesson, I do have a summary up here. But if you don't totally understand the Scramble for Africa, there's 2 videos you could watch at home. But there's also an online resource that you could read today here. So this is a resource that has some notes about how Europeans find their way to Africa and why they go to Africa. And it's actually going to take you all the way up to decolonization. So looking at this website may take you 20 minutes today. After you're done that, then you go to the applied studies. And the applied studies will take you to this document. And in this document, there's very targeted goals with each of these sources. So you get to a source and it's like, look for specific details within the source that announces for us that it's either about decolonization or about imperial or pro-imperializing Africa. And that's the assignment today.